Metropolitan Chicago is one of the most religiously diverse areas in the world, and for more than a half century, Sanctuary has reported and reflected on our faith-filled community. Sanctuary tells stories of faith from both inside our houses of worship to the streets and neighborhoods where faith is acted out every day with acts of kindness and concern. From food pantries to peace initiatives, from worship services to servicing the poor, Sanctuary has a proud history of reporting on the goodness that flows from our faith traditions. Watch Sanctuary every Sunday at 12 noon. Welcome to Sanctuary, bringing you conversation and stories at the intersection of life and faith. This edition of Sanctuary is produced in cooperation with the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago.
Hello, I'm Nisan, Chavkin, Executive Director of the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago. Welcome to this episode of Sanctuary. The Chicago Police Department, as part of and empowered by the community, is committed to protect the lives, property, and rights of all people, to maintain order and to enforce the law impartially. This is actually the first sentence of the CPD mission statement. Every day, CPD serves people representing every background in our city. Policing fairly and respectfully in such a diverse setting can be challenging, particularly in matters of religious belief, dress, and practice. Today on Sanctuary, we'll discuss new and exciting initiatives of the Chicago Police Department to strengthen their communication and interactions with the many faith communities in the city. To help us understand these innovations, I'm joined in studio today by Michael Milstein, Deputy Director of Community Policing for the Chicago Police Department. And a little later on, we'll be speaking with Officer Michael Carroll, Religious Communities Outreach Liaison for the Chicago Police Department. But we begin now with Michael Milstein, and I want to welcome him and thank you for joining us, Michael.
Thank you, Nisan. Happy to be here.
Good. I am. Tell us about this job you have, your Deputy Community Policing. What does that do?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just thank you again for inviting us to be here today. We really appreciate you welcoming us into this space and look forward to telling the viewers more about what we're doing here. It's really great work. But again, Mike Milstein, Deputy Director for Community Policing, Chicago Police Department. And really, what I try to focus on a lot is how do we bring in the community? How do we bring in residents into the department's reform efforts? So much of the time in the past, many of our policies, our procedures, our trainings, they've been developed in a vacuum by officers who, know how it works for an officer, but may not necessarily know how that policy or that training is impacting the public. And so what I try to focus on is creating spaces and mechanisms for the broader public to be engaged in our reform efforts, where we are, revising our policies with community partnership or with community collaboration. We're revising our trainings, having co-trainers with the community being a part of that process with us, so that we really are creating great policies and procedures and trainings that are both informed by the officers, but also by experiences, the lived and direct experiences by the residents who that policy or training is intended to be serving.
That's very helpful. So for our viewers, could you, being a police officer it's a full-time profession, there's a lot that goes into it. Could you tell us, how do you prepare officers, how do you teach them? How do you get them ready to go out and serve the community? And then how do you monitor and guide their work once they're serving on the streets? How does that work? Could you just give us an overview there?
Yeah, absolutely. All of our officers go through really extensive training, both as a recruit in the academy, but also, throughout the year, once already in the job. We call that in-service training. Currently, every officer right now receives at least 40 hours of in-service training. So once they're already on the job, they go through at minimum 40 hours of training throughout the year, and that has continued to increase the last couple of years and will likely continue to increase going forward. So really having more and more training is such a key component to really making sure officers are performing their jobs well. A lot of our training right now is centered around impartial policing and procedural justice, cultural awareness, really key components that we're trying to make sure every officer has that knowledge and that skill set for, because so much of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis is interacting with the public. And in a community or a city as diverse as Chicago, that's such an important piece here, is that procedural justice, that impartial policing, and being very aware of different cultures and backgrounds across the city.
Yeah, it's and with you layer religious experiences on top of that, it gets even more exciting. Yeah?
Absolutely, and that's why we're really happy that this is such a great policy, which will now have a really great training behind it as well, because most folks don't think about different religious identities and expressions, and so we're really happy to have this policy now part of our impartial policing and human rights section, and we'll really excited about developing that training as well.
Yeah, so we're talking about this new policy called General Order GO 20105, the Religious Interactions Policy, and what does it do? Where did it come from? Why? I think as the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago, we've been privileged to have some input on this policy, but what's the department's impetus? What's guiding us here, and how did you think this policy up?
Absolutely. I think the department has primarily had different language in other policies around how to respect people with different religious identities, but never really language as detailed or comprehensive as what this policy has. This is one that both the consent decree, specified that the department should have, and we've heard from communities saying that there needs to be more guidance to officers about how to respectfully interact with someone of different religious identities as well. And so, as you mentioned, we were incredibly grateful to the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago for partnering with us on developing this policy. This is a brand new policy for the department. One that we felt was really important that needed to be developed both between the department and a community group or communities from different religious identities and backgrounds, and not just groups that are more prominently known in the city, but also some of those religious groups that may not be as well known, or folks may not, or many officers may not know exist in the city. Really having a diverse background and a diverse group of folks that we're collaborating with on this policy. The policy, it's really intended to ensure that department members are being respectful and making accommodations for all individuals, regardless of their religious identities or their religious beliefs. It lays out the requirements and a direction that officers need when they're interacting with someone who has specific religious beliefs. It also says what they can't do. So it tells officers they can't use derogatory language that may offend someone. Mm-hmm. They can't use an individual's religious expression as reasonable suspicion. And they can't share that individual's religious beliefs with somebody else that they may be close to, or say if they're in a lockup or a holding cell, they can't share that identity with somebody else. To that point, it also explains how officers, when they unfortunately have to arrest or hold an individual with different religious backgrounds, how to respectfully bring that person in, how to transport them, how to arrest them, and what kind of holding procedures should be followed to ensure that that individual may have access to specific religious items, or is still being mindful to the religious clothing, different objects, prayer times, or really any other reasonable considerations that need to be made for someone who has a specific religious background while they may be in a holding cell. Oh,
that sounds really complicated, really comprehensive, and really admirable. In terms of when you're out in the field, not arresting people, but just trying to interact with people, it's also an enormous amount of information for anybody, for anyone who works in this, much less for someone who's a generalist like a police officer. What kind of resources is the department providing so that your officers have, they can keep their masjids, street from their synagogues, separated from their church, from their temple, or what have you? How are you helping them out there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great point. And again, we're happy to partner with the council on this, is that we also developed a glossary of terms. Mm-hmm. I think as folks are aware, there's so many different important terms and concepts within the religious community that many officers probably not aware of all of that. And so with this policy is also a really comprehensive glossary of different terms with definitions that officers should be aware of, or if they need to look up when they're in the field, having an interaction with someone, they don't really know what that individual, that specific object is, having a glossary on hand that they can go back to. Also, the next step, obviously, with a policy, the next step to that is training. Mm-hmm. So having a really comprehensive training, one that we believe should be partnered between the department and co-taught by the community, that really explains to officers how to have a respectful and meaningful interaction with someone, regardless of religious identity, but how to be mindful as well of different cultural norms, different religious customs, that they don't offend anyone, that they are being mindful of all of that. So really just a comprehensive and really meaningful training that every officer will then get.
Yeah, and of course, so many of those things change and you just learn in the field. And
Absolutely.
you adjust. There'll be mistakes, of course, but that disposition to goodwill and working with folks sounds very, very admirable. And this policy is new to the department, and as I understand it, it's also the first of its kind in the United States.
Yep.
Is that true?
To our knowledge, it is.
Wow.
Unless someone can find anything else. To my knowledge, it is as well, yeah.
Very impressive, and I'm glad we're thinking of that here in the 21st century. And I guess one question is, why now? What offer, and how important is it now for the police department to use this, and how will it allow you to strengthen relations and communication with faith communities here in town?
Oh, I think it's so important that we have this, and I really encourage every other police department to consider a policy like this as well. So often, departments right now across the country are making these efforts to reform and to have new practices that really embody equity and inclusiveness. But sometimes it's folks are forgetting about their religious community and how diverse the religious community is. And so I think it's important that we're being mindful of that as well, and that this policy is really attempting to do that, to be mindful of the different religious groups, religious identities across the city and across the country. As mentioned, Chicago is such a diverse city. I'll be honest, as a Jewish individual, I had no idea about some of the more smaller religious communities in the city until learning more from the council and through this policy. So I can't even imagine what many officers know or what other residents know as well. So just being mindful of every religious community, even including and especially those smaller communities that most folks may not be aware of, is so important for every police department to have. And again, I absolutely encourage other police departments to look at this policy and consider doing something very similar in those cities.
Well, it certainly makes a lot of sense, and it's an exciting point to be at the front and leading the country on this important question. It's very, very exciting and profoundly meaningful, and I think particularly for young people who are in the academy, just learning about the great diversity of our city and all of its cultures and its faiths is a real contribution. Michael Milstein, Deputy Director of Community Policing for the Chicago Police Department, I want to thank you for joining us and for helping us understand this new policy from the department. Our conversation continues just ahead on Sanctuary, so please stay with us.
Metropolitan Chicago is one of the most religiously diverse areas in the world, and for more than a half-century, Sanctuary has reported and reflected on our faith-filled community. Sanctuary tells stories of faith from both inside our houses of worship to the streets and neighborhoods where faith is acted out every day with acts of kindness and concern. From food pantries to peace initiatives, from worship services to servicing the poor, Sanctuary has a proud history of reporting on the goodness that flows from our faith traditions. Watch Sanctuary every Sunday at 12 noon.
Welcome back to Sanctuary. I'm Nisan Chavkin, and our conversation on policing fairly and respectfully in the city of Chicago continues now with Officer Michael Carroll, Religious Communities Outreach Liaison for the Chicago Police Department. Michael, thank you for joining us. Michael's okay, yes?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Nisan.
Okay, and this office, it's a new position, right?
It is, yeah. Absolutely.
How long has it been around, and are you the first one, and how did you get to be the liaison? What's our backstory here?
I am the first one. The job came out about 4 or 5 months ago. There are other officers that work in this kind of position, but mine's focused obviously on the faith communities. So it came out, like I said, a couple of months ago. For me, my background, I've been an officer for about 18 years, but the idea of this position and why I thought I would fit in it when it come out was that in college, I had studied theology. I had worked overseas. I studied in Japan. I studied in Israel, taken Japanese, Arabic. For me, it was, I wanted to have more of a knowledge base personally, learn more about it. I was that kid in school that wanted to learn more about other cultures and other communities. And then my background, when it came out, was just, they had asked a job interview saying, is there anyone in the department who would fit this position? And when I saw it pop up on our little internet at work, I thought this would be me perfectly, my background. So I put in for it, and a few months later, I got the position.
Wow. So have you kept your languages up? I'm just curious.
Not as much as I had liked. I had taken Arabic, I had taken Japanese. I lived in Bangkok, Thailand for about 9 months, and I worked in AIDS hospice and orphanage. And my time there, I even joked, I'm like, I can't take a third or fourth language. I'm just going to lose it. So I do try to practice those languages, and with this new post, I get to do it more and more often, going to new communities and meeting with them and talking with them, sometimes in their own language, as best as I can.
Yes, and the effort itself is sometimes such a bridge.
Yeah,
that's a wonderful thing.
sure.
So what is the purpose of this new post? This is not like chaplains in the department, right? Which way do you face? Are you serving the officers, serving the communities? How does this work?
It's kind of both. So for us in the department, this idea is there are some faith communities that we have in the city that work hand in hand with police every day, and we've been doing that for decades and decades. There are also smaller communities that are smaller faith groups in our city, mostly non-Christian faith groups that just might not have that kind of a connection with the department. And the idea of this is to do outreach to those communities by me and other officers from the districts, but focusing more on those faith groups that don't have as large of a population in our city. So sometimes in other parts of the world, the police might not be seen in the same light as they are here, where if you need a police officer, we urge you, anyone, to contact police, to dial 911 or to reach out to police. There are some communities from around the world that might not think that way. Maybe in their country where they come from, the police are not that same kind of group. So the idea is that to do outreach to those communities, to say, listen, I don't care where you're from, what community, what culture, what language, what faith, that you can contact the police and we're there to serve. Reaching out to that community, the hard thing is often these communities might think that officers don't know their culture, might think their dress is different. My thought on first talking about working with those faith communities, now working with officers, is to do the outreach to saying these people in these communities are just like us. Their kids go to school, they have to worry about paying the bills, cutting the lawn, getting your hair cut, things like that. It's the same groups and that are here, that are in this culture, this community, and it's important for me and our department to teach our officers that we serve everybody. It doesn't matter their dress or their faith or their language.
Yeah, and I think for communities of people who may have been born in another country and are new here in Chicago, and even for little communities that have been here a long time, it's one thing to hear that you're supposed to go to the police, but sometimes there's people feel some hesitation, rightly or wrongly.
True.
And how do we get them over that threshold so that, or how are you, when in your day, in your job, your typical day, if you have one, are you doing to sort of reach out to them and help them understand that the police department can be a partner in some of their work and certainly in their community?
Yeah. So for me, it's by getting out into the field. I think that you can make as many phone calls, as many texts and emails as you can want, but unless you're there face to face with them in their own space, in their own community, you lose that edge, the opportunity to really reach out to those communities. Prior to being a police officer, I was in the Peace Corps, and one of the things that I keep with me from that is I bring my knowledge base, what I had, to that country. And in the same regard is you bring what you learn in that country back here. So the idea is that you learn from them in those communities. For me, it's important to go out there to those communities and talk to them, learn from them the things that they need us to do. And if I don't know that community, learn it, get to know it. Talk to people in that community. Maybe they're officers who work on that beat, who speak their language, who are of that faith background. Working with them to get a better understanding of that faith community, but also knowing that in the end we're here to serve those communities. So there are some communities that, as we said before, just don't call the police. Getting them to know that they can contact the police, to work together to solve whatever issues are in their community. And that's the focus that I have, is getting out there physically in their communities, going on their day of worship, days before, days after. And every group's different. You know, it's not one large group. You have to know that each specific culture, community, language, faith is different, and know there's those differences, accept them, and working together. That's the best way to solve crimes and to work together for many other issues.
No, I get it. And so I am worried a little bit about how much sleep you're going to get. The city's got 3 million people.
Yeah.
There are dozens and dozens of houses of worship and faith-based institutions in every police district in our city.
Yes.
How how do you get out there? How do you encourage them to come to you? Or is it just you? Are there other people that are able to help in this effort?
Yeah.
To build that kind of trust? And I think that's something that Superintendent Brown has talked about, the trust of the community with police departments, so that there are those opportunities to work together on common concerns.
Absolutely, yeah. So every district should have a faith-based officer. He or she should be reaching out and reach out to those communities. Because again, like I said before, every district is different, every group is different. So every district should have a faith-based officer. He or she reaches out to them to talk to them about the issues that they're having. For me, it would be more of working with all of those officers, and some communities already have a very strong bond with officers. My focus would be on those faith communities that don't have that kind of a strong police group working with officers every day. So it is a big city, and a lot of these churches, temples, mosques are the backbone of these communities. They know who's in the community. They know the good guys. They also know the bad guys. So each district should be working, the hope would work with those faith communities as best as we can to serve them, but also those ones that don't have that relationship with officers have or grow that relationship with officers. But it is a big city, and for me, and I would tell all the officers that I would work with in this capacity, reach out, get to know those faith communities, get to know because they are the backbone of that community, of that culture.
Yeah, so I think that reaching out is often, particularly for, if you've never met someone from another religious community, or you're in a part of the city you haven't been in before,
Yeah.
what's your, how do you approach a spot or a community that you're not as familiar with? Do you just go to the local coffee shop? What do you do?
That's actually great, because I actually do that quite often, going to the coffee shop, meeting the store owner, because often if you live and work in the community, you also go to service in that same community. And even if you don't, if you're the shopkeeper and you're next to the temple or next to the church, you know the ins and outs of that community because you're part of that community, even if you don't pray at their church or at their temple. So going to those communities. For me, I was taught when I first came in the job 18 years ago, if you're not learning something new every day, you're not trying hard enough. You should be every single day working to get to know the beat that you work on. If you're a beat car, if you work on with the K9 unit, every day you should be working to know more about your community, to better serve them. Because if you don't know the people that you serve in, how are you going to serve them well? So if I was a brand new officer on the street, I would tell them, get out there and get to know that faith community that you're working for, because that's the best way to actually serve that community. So for me, if there was a group that I'm not as, they don't have a background in through school or personally being in that country or living in that community, do that outreach. Go to the mosque, knock on the door. Sometimes it's a little bit scary to not know where you're going into, but like I said earlier when we were talking, is these communities, they've got kids, they have families, they pay their taxes, they have to worry about, the basic stuff that everybody does. Don't treat them different because they look different or they pray to at a different temple or speak a different language. In the end, we're all the same. So I chose this job to serve my community, and that's what I want to do in every community. So I'm blessed, I guess you'd say. I'm happy that I have the opportunity to go learn these new things every day. Go to those communities and learn more about these faiths.
Well, that's a great orientation and a welcome part of policing in the city. And for those that you haven't met yet, is there a way that they can reach you?
Yeah.
What's the best way to get a hold of you or the other religious community outreach liaisons as a close?
So in every district, please don't be shy. You can always contact that district directly. You can dial 311 to get more information about your police district. Me personally, Michael, Michael, period, Carroll, that's spelled Carroll, the number 2, at chicagopolice.org. That's the best way to get a hold of me via email. I have that phone always on me, so I'm often checking the emails, but anyone wanted to reach out, I would love to learn more about your faith community, any issues, and try to get you connected to whatever we can do as a department.
Well, Officer Michael Carroll, our religious communities outreach liaison for the Chicago Police Department, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today and telling us about your post. I want to thank as well our guest earlier in the program, Michael Milstein, Deputy Director of Community Policing for the Chicago Police Department. And as always, we thank each and every one of you for joining us. We hope to see you again next time on Sanctuary.
Metropolitan Chicago is one of the most religiously diverse areas in the world, and for more than a half-century, Sanctuary has reported and reflected on our faith-filled community. Sanctuary tells stories of faith from both inside our houses of worship to the streets and neighborhoods where faith is acted out every day with acts of kindness and concern. From food pantries to peace initiatives, from worship services to servicing the poor, Sanctuary has a proud history of reporting on the goodness that flows from our faith traditions. Watch Sanctuary every Sunday at 12 noon